Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a Valiant Armory Malatesta, or at least I think that's how you pronounce the name. And this particular version is one from a bygone era that is unfortunately not purchasable today. If you like the overall look and shape of the sword, I can't blame you. It's very handsome, and you can buy something remarkably similar looking today, but comparing them in terms of quality wouldn't be fair. This Malatesta was from the days when Valiant Armory outsourced some of the blades, and they sold products around about the $500 price point. They offer, and still offer, a lot of different variations. You can have things antiqued, you can do different, there's options that you can do to make the sword a little more or less expensive. But this one would have been around $500-ish. And today, the Malatesta, if you want something that looks like it, is around $1,300 or $1,400. But they're not the same sword. The blades are made in-house today. They're likely quite a bit more competently heat treated, and so they're really not fair to compare. So just know that if you want something like this, they are available, but it comes at a steeper price point. What I'm going to tell you about, though, is just the bits, bob, fit features. I think it's fun to see what Valiant Armory was producing. This was probably around 10 years ago that this sword was produced, or maybe a little older, and it was, again, around about $500. And Valiant Armory still produces some really amazing leather work today. It's unquestionable that the scabbards and whatnot that come with their swords are really quite top-notch and a cut above what a lot of other manufacturers produce. A lot of manufacturers don't do scabbards, or if they do, they don't necessarily put as much attention into them as they do the swords. And Valiant Armory, that isn't necessarily the case. The fittings have a little bit of extra zazz, which I'm a fan of, and the leather work has always been really, really quite good. Anyway, I'll go over the bits, bob, fit features, all that kind of stuff, and hopefully you find it interesting. Anyway, measurements, links, and all that kind of stuff will be in the description down below if you're interested. Starting with the pommel, first off, it's a hex nut construction, and Valiant Armory very often for this series of swords had hex nut constructions where you could take them apart, and that was an endearing feature to many who like to customize and change up some of the parts. It was a lot easier to do if it wasn't peened, though peening was an option. You can see that this hex nut is chewed up a little bit. That was kind of the downside of the hex nut. If you tighten them too much, the nut could get stripped out, and it could ruin your day if you're trying to change, if you're trying to take it apart or put it back together. But I digress. Peening was typically an option. This scent stopper pommel is also one of my favorite designs. Now, the Valiant Armory one is crisp. Let me say that. Nothing bites into my hands. It's not super sharp, but it's teetering on uncomfortable in terms of the facets being a little bit more jagged than they need to be. In a glove, I don't notice that. In bare hands, I can. If I really start swinging it around, I can kind of feel some of these ledges biting into me. Not so much, though. It's a little bit more crisp than perhaps I would like, because it does chew into my hands a little bit. At the same time, I love how crisp and clean this looks. It's one of my favorite shapes, and it rests and fits really well in my hand. Overall, it's really comfortable, and I'm just complaining about it because that's the thing I do with swords. Overall, though, this was just a cut above. The facets are nice and crisp and clean, and with a sword in the $500 price point, very often they're not. It's kind of muddy. It looks like one cast piece that's been put under a buffing wheel or something, and in this, all the facets look crisp and clean and nice, and it was an attention to detail that you don't commonly find and didn't commonly find in $500 swords. If I move up to where the pommel area meets the grip, now this is a little bit oblong. The transition isn't great. I can see where the leather's folding in, but at least the leather isn't like jutting out or haphazardly placed or anything. I would say that the transition could line up a little bit better, at least to my eye visually. At the same time, there's really no major issue other than it looks a little oddly sized. Though, historically speaking, there were pommels that jetted into the grip and were oddly sized. So I don't know that it's ahistoric or anything like that. At the same time, it would have been nice if the cylindrical side of the grip came down and matched roughly the size of the pommel. At least I would have found that a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Anyway, I like the pommel, I like the shape, I like the facets. I think it's incredibly handsome. I do generally prefer the peened options, but I bought this secondhand. It wasn't my choice, and it still overall looks like a good execution, and it's still on there quite tight, even though haven't played with it since I bought it. The grip. This is another one that VA always did really well. There's dimension and swell here, and it's a little chunkier than perhaps some of the other grips that I've had out there, particularly in the center riser section. But no matter where I hold it, the grip feels good in my hand, with or without a glove. It indexes well. It moves well in my hand if I want to turn the sword. And this center swell here really keeps things locked into place, and I do feel a sense of connection with the blade that well, is easy to lose when the grip is too cylindrical or doesn't index well or slides around, and none of that is really the case. I've used this with wet hands and dry hands and with and without gloves, and in any case, the grip overall is comfortable, and there's nothing really that bites me apart from some of the crisp edges. There's no leather seam that I'm really able to make out here, and this was, again, just very impressive stuff, given that this was around $500, and at the time, you know, $500 didn't necessarily buy you much, and getting a sword with a scabbard with this kind of leather work on it was really quite impressive. Especially since the grip also, it's not just that the leather work is done, the shaping is also got dimensioned, and it swells and tapers down and rounds out, and it has actually some thought put behind it, which is much appreciated. Moving up to the crossguard, well, transition-wise, this one lines up quite a bit better. Crossguard suffers from some of the same crispness issues in that it looks great, it's nice and clean looking, but some of the ledges are teetering on the maybe too sharp side of things. And so if you're really choking down on the grip or on the crossguard and you whack it into your hand, it potentially can bite you. At the same time, it has a really clean look, so some of this could be sanded down without diminishing it too much. I guess I'd rather have it too sharp because I can't sharpen it up easily, but I can kind of sand it down or take a rod and kind of go over some of the edges and maybe tamper them down just a little bit. But I like how crisp and clean and how much dimension it has in it. It has little holes or eyelets here that add some dimension, as well as these grooves that are cut in. The grip also has just profile. It has a center ridge. It's a simple enough looking shape. At the same time, it just has a lot of dimension and character to it. And then where it rests on the, where I guess it meets the scabbard or the grip is also really well transitioned. I like how the mouth of the scabbard has been cut out to have the same recess, or at least the same general shape as the crossguard does. It makes it a nicer looking package in totality. Now, unfortunately, the gap in the crossguard is not great. There is a pretty sizable gap on either side. This is just a cosmetic thing, a nuance that sword review people tend to harp on quite a bit. I like to see very tight tolerances, but at the same time, that isn't present here. It is fair to say, though, that I would rather have a visually stunning crossguard with crisp, clean lines rather than something kind of dumpy and oblong looking, but no gap in the space between the crossguard and the blade. Anyway, there is a small one here. It's worth noting that it's there if that matters to you. The scabbard is another one that is just visually stunning. It has a belt system. I didn't get a belt with it, but I believe you could get different types of belt systems with it. The leather mouth is wrapped over. It doesn't have a metal mouth area on it, but it does. The leather does wrap over, so visually it looks quite nice. It has different belts. These were available in a myriad of different colors. The staining on it is really clean. The little risers on it are really quite visually appealing. The seam on the back doesn't have very prominent stitching. I'm not sure exactly how they get it in here, but overall it looks reasonably clean and well done. It's not ripply or bouncy. The woodwork for the core must be reasonably well done. The shape at the end has a little ledge that sticks out, but overall, again, the metal work and fittings on here are really quite nice, and one of my favorite features of the sword. I don't really know what you're supposed to have from a European sword. There's some conjecture on how much it should bind or not. This one, it doesn't have any tension on it. That's something that I could remedy with some shims or something like that if it bothered me. But it's also that it's not very raspy. It glides in and out relatively smoothly, and it seems well fit to the blade. At the same time, it could be tensioned a little differently, though that's something that I really don't know how what their stance is or what they're trying to do or what to expect from a new one. This one, though, falls out pretty easily, so if you wanted to tension it, presumably, you would need to shim it. Now the blade, the pointy stabby part, the part that maybe more people are interested in, I believe the Malatesta has a similar blade profile today. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I hope it's improved a little bit because this blade is floppy. It really has a lot of wiggle and bounce to it, and it feels lively and nimble, and it's not uncomfortable in the hand. But for a sword that feels like, or has the kind of dimension that should lend itself to the chop, it really feels quite a bit more nimble in the hand than it should, but it also isn't very rigid. It'll bend and flex and move around. So I hope that the rigidity is improved in the newer versions and is a little thicker in some spots to make it a little less whippy, because I think of this sword generally as whippy. It generally does flex quite a bit up at the tip. I'm not sure if it's supposed to or not, but In this particular case, it does. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing for an older sword. A lot of medieval swords from a decade or more ago were overbuilt and very cumbersome and heavy, so having something that is whippy is is not necessarily ahistoric. I don't know how whippy they were, but I have seen many historical swords that were quite a bit thinner than some of their modern recreations, but also is just quite a bit different. Feels a little bit more nimble in the hand than a lot of the older pieces from 10 or 15 years ago might have. Anyway, the blade itself is also not particularly sharp. It doesn't have a very great edge on the blade itself, but it does have good lines, and that lends itself actually to cutting pretty well. So despite the fact that it's not particularly sharp, it's got a reasonable edge on it, but I didn't expect it to cut particularly well. However, when I brought it out to actually do some cutting, I was really surprised that it was able to cut as well as it did. And most of that isn't like a razor keen edge, but just very good edge geometry, having a single bevel without at least a very prominent secondary bevel. And it moves around pretty well. It's a pretty thin blade, and so cutting wise, it's another fun one to move around. I'm not a big fan of kind of the whippiness. It's more a surprise. Like, it visually looks great to me, but when I move it around, I'm always feeling like the weight of the blade is moving it more than I am, or that it's causing it to droop or something like that. Anyway, that is what I can tell you about the Valiant Armory Malatesta. Hopefully it's an interesting video. If you find one of these in the wild secondhand, the way to tell apart the newer version, as I understand it, is Valiant Armory stamps or puts on their maker's mark that shows their Craftsman series, and that's one way to differentiate the older versions that cost around $500 to the newer ones that were around $1,400, because there is manufacturing differences in how they're made. They're both good swords, but this one, is not something I would advocate paying $1,400 for. But hopefully a new one is worth it. However, if you find these old Valiant Armory pieces in the wild from the days when they imported blades, they still have a lot to offer, and hopefully some of the video here give you some idea of what to expect if you find one in the secondhand market. They're still pretty fun to have. They still look quite impressive, and they still make a worthy addition to your collection. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully it's been interesting. Cheers, and thanks for watching.